Chapter 11 of The Way to Willpower by Henry Hazlitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. Will and the Psychoanalysts. Practically within the last few years, there has grown up a body of doctrine, gradually becoming surrounded with a formidable literature, which its proponents call a science. And I shall not start an argument at the very beginning by denying its title to that word. This body of doctrine is called psychoanalysis. It is not quite clear whether its adherents consider it a branch of psychology or a competitor. But at all events, it has just now become ubiquitous. It is in the air. It is the fad. It has come out of the laboratories into the drawing rooms, out of the consulting rooms into the newspapers. It is discussed by doctors and book reviewers and spinsters and schoolgirls. It deals with human action, with the mind, the will, the desires. It lays down recommendations, and any modern book upon the will, though it may embrace or damn psychoanalysis, cannot afford to ignore it. Now, it is very difficult to pass fair judgment upon this body of doctrine. It is so young. It has already, to my mind, made not unimportant steps in the treatment and cure of insanity and nervous diseases, and bids fair to make greater. Its theories of multiple personalities and the meaning of dreams seem to me fruitful working hypotheses, destined to add to the achievements of psychiatry. Its explanations of Puritanism and of certain phases of war psychology, utterly apart from the question of whether or not they have scientific value, are delicious and effective bits of satire. And as with Thorsten Veblen's work in economics, the satire is heightened, not diminished, by the dry scientific vocabulary in which it is wrapped, and the impartial scientific attitude which it affects. Psychoanalysis doubtless is proceeding on many wrong theories, but it is constantly testing those theories. And as time goes on, the bad will be cast upon the scrap heap and new and better theories substituted. It is tapping and specializing upon a vein which the academic psychology had neglected. It has attracted wide popular interest. It has brought controversy into psychology, and controversy, with experiments to prove or disprove, always means life and growth and progress, and is the enemy of stagnation. It is true that the literature of psychoanalysis is morbid, gruesome, depressing, filled with sexual perversions, with incest, sadism, masochism, onanism, sodomy. But what would you? Medical books on physical diseases are also horrible, but necessary. Spiritual scabs and ravages and pus are more revolting than physical. But like the physical, if we are to combat them, we must study them with the cold, detached impartiality of the physician. We must for the moment put aside our moral platitudes and denunciations and contempt and study the disease and its cure. The physician does not denounce his patient for becoming ill, though the patient may well deserve it. He seeks first to restore health. Admonition can only follow. But when I have said all this in favor of psychoanalysis, I have said almost as much as I conscientiously can. Few of its practitioners are well grounded in psychology, and fewer in biology and medicine. It utilizes orthodox medicine, biology, psychology, anatomy, and physiology when they can be used to prove a special point, and rejects them when they cannot. There is hardly a single analyst who could be called a cautious thinker. Most of them do not appear to know the difference between a substantiated theory and a guess. Presumptive evidence is set down as if it were conclusive evidence. Some of their deductions are highly fanciful. They would be extremely difficult to verify, and there is usually no attempt at verification. Whenever human nature is praised, proof is required. But apparently, whenever it is satirized or insulted, proof is deemed superfluous. The most dubious conjecture, based on the frailest kind of evidence, is set down with the positive air of a fact. Explanations for which the best that can be said is that they are possible or plausible are treated as if they were the final and only ones, though alternative explanations, at least equally and possibly more plausible, and certainly nowhere near as far-fetched, may occur to a person not altogether hypnotized by the Freudian interpretation. It is one of the foremost Freudian theories, if indeed it is not the foremost, that every dream, not some dreams, mind you, but every one, represents the gratification of some desire suppressed or repressed during the waking state. This desire, according to Freud, is practically always a sexual one. At least the predominance of the sexual element appears to be overwhelming. Now, such a theory in its bald state would not impose upon a half-witted person. So the psychoanalysts go on to show that most of our dreams are symbolic. And what ingenious symbolism! The unconscious mind asleep seems to be infinitely more clever than the conscious mind awake. It is also a theory of Freud's that every act, every slip of the tongue, every bit of absent-mindedness or forgetfulness means something. Forgetting a name, an event, or a figure is not merely a failure to remember. It is a positive act. We forget because we have an unconscious desire to forget. The fact or name is associated with something unpleasant, and the mind tends to eject it, or the unconscious to suppress it. I wish I had time for your edification to quote a few typical examples of the interpretations which the psychoanalysts give of different dreams and trivial acts in the light of these theories. Their capacity for reading anything they choose into anything they want is utterly enormous. You would sometimes think from a few of these interpretations that the psychoanalysts were satirizing or burlesquing themselves. Really, it is not so. But the reader who has sufficient psychologic curiosity to be interested in seeing how a theory can be ridden to death and then pulled to its feet and ridden again would find unsurpassed material by delving a little into psychoanalytic literature. A large part of the interest in psychoanalysis is almost wholly prurient. It is to the fact that it deals so largely with sex, I verily believe, that it owes the larger part of its popular vogue. It seems, too, to have a certain tendency to wallow in it and find a morbid fascination in it. Examples of sexual abnormalities are piled up with a relish not unlike that which gossiping people have in retailing scandal, and often apparently with the same object, to tell the tale for the sake of the tale. The examples are usually more than are needed to enforce a given conclusion, though the exact bearing of each upon the conclusion is not always indicated. There can be little doubt that the reading of psychoanalytic literature tends to suggest and arouse sexual trains of thought in the minds of many readers, and I am here speaking of normal readers, and not of what the psychoanalysts would call a sexually hypersensitive or hyperesthetic reader. The same, of course, may be true of a medical book. I am not condemning. I am merely stating a fact. This statement has been made before, and one psychoanalyst has attempted to answer it in this wise. Quote, "The sexual material is present in every subject, normal or abnormal, and comes to the surface very easily. No suggestion is necessary to bring it forth." End quote. That is emphatically not an answer. We have seen before in our inquiry into the nature of desire that desires are not ever present, but become active only when some train of thought or some external observation or stimulus has aroused them. And we illustrated by a phonograph record, which, while it preserves a tune, is silent when it isn't being played. The example of passing the fruit stand was given as a case in point. The like is true of sexual desires. Whether a desire comes to the surface or stays below is a point of very great importance. The psychoanalytic model is incomplete, insufficiently checked up by other methods, and rests upon some dubious assumptions. It seeks to interpret the normal mind through a study of the abnormal mind. This is a perfectly valid and useful method with improper limits, but it can be overdone and rashly handled. Quote, "The neurotic," says one psychoanalyst, "only accentuates certain general human traits and tendencies, and he makes them thereby easier to observe." End quote. Such a statement needs qualification. Instead of accentuating a trait of a normal man, the neurotic may be neurotic because he so greatly distorts it. Disease symptoms do not accentuate health symptoms. Finally, to all these sins, psychoanalysis adds the unforgivable crime of pedantry. I do not know of a science that habitually wraps its thoughts in such awesome and jaw-cracking phraseology, with such a maze of newly coined words, above all, habitually tacking on the magic word complex after describing any trait whatever in order to make it sound as if something very profound had been pointed out. When most of these psychoanalytic thoughts are disentangled from the verbiage in which they are snarled and concealed and lie before you in all their nakedness, they are seen to be either very commonplace and obvious, or very absurd. Such a discovery might be suspected in advance, for poverty of thought habitually tries to conceal itself beneath a deluge of diction. This may be a case of the unconscious or the inferiority complex forming a self-protective neurosis. But this is digressing. My purpose is not to criticize psychoanalysis as a whole, but to examine one of its cardinal doctrines, which seems to me to bear directly on the subject of willpower. But first, I shall have to explain what that doctrine is. The psychoanalysts lay a good deal of stress upon what is commonly called the subconscious, and what they call the unconscious. Their conception of the unconscious is vividly described by Mr. Andre Trident in a book on psychoanalysis and behavior, from which I shall take the liberty of quoting. Quote, "Our unconscious contains two sorts of thoughts, those which rise easily to the surface of our consciousness, and those which remain at the bottom and can only be made to rise with more or less difficulty. Our unconscious mind is like a pool into which dead leaves, dust, raindrops, and 1,000 other things are falling day after day, some of them floating on the surface for a while, some sinking to the bottom, and all of them, after a while, merging themselves with the water or the ooze. Let us suppose that 2 dead dogs, one of them weighted down with a stone, have been thrown into that pool. They will poison its water, and people wishing to use those waters will have to rake the ooze and remove the rotting carrion. The dog whose body was not fastened to any heavy object will easily be brought to the surface and removed. The other will be more difficult to recover, and if the stone is very heavy, may remain in the pool until ways and means are devised to dismember him or to cut the rope holding him down." End quote. Now, these 2 dogs may be made to represent 2 sorts of desires or cravings. The first of these are cravings of which we are aware, but which, because they are immoral or socially detrimental, or difficult or impossible to gratify for some other reason, remain unacted upon. These are called suppressed desires. The second are cravings which we not only fail to gratify, but of whose very existence we are unaware. If someone were to suggest that we had such cravings, we might even vehemently, and perhaps honestly, deny it. These are called repressed desires. Now, say the psychoanalysts, though we can suppress or repress our cravings, we cannot annihilate them. To use one of their similes, quote, "Whether we remain in ignorance of the fact that a boiler is full of steam or simply disregard that fact, the steam is there, seeking an outlet and likely to create an abnormal one, unless a normal outlet is provided." End quote. What will this abnormal outlet be? According to the psychoanalysts, it may take several forms. Quote, "Between the compelling instinct and the opposing force of sexual denial, for instance, the way is prepared for some disturbance which does not solve the conflict, but seeks to escape it by changing the libidinous cravings into symptoms of disease." End quote. In other words, the suppression or repression of sexual cravings, they assert, will lead to anxiety dreams, nightmares, nervous disorders, intolerance, hallucinations, dual and multiple personalities, insanity, or burst out in abnormal sexual perversions of a revolting sort. They bring forth examples of perversions in great men. They point with a finger of warning at the ascetics and holy men and women who were fighting the flesh, and contend that these exchange normal reality for hallucinations and normal desires for perverse desires. And what cure do they suggest? Here I must be cautious and warn the reader that the psychoanalysts do not altogether agree upon this matter among themselves. I will try, however, as best I may, to do justice to the bulk of their opinion. They believe, first, that we should be made conscious of our repressed cravings. To make the subject conscious of these, they interpret his acts, study his dreams, unravel the symbolism, and gradually inform the patient what his repressed cravings are. This is cutting the rope that holds the dead dog down. The first job is to bring him to the surface. Critics have feared that causing these unconscious cravings to rise to consciousness may cause them to overpower the patient's ethical strivings. The belief has also been expressed that this method may suggest a craving or put into the mind of the patient a harmful idea that was not there before. Freud, the originator and patron saint of psychoanalysis, has answered to the first criticism that a wish whose repression has failed is incomparably stronger when it remains unconscious than when it is made conscious. The unconscious wish cannot be influenced and is not hindered by strivings in the opposite direction, while the conscious wish is inhibited by other conscious wishes of an opposing nature. I shall not take sides in this particular argument, but shall merely content myself with presenting the 2 points of view, leaving the reader to judge of their merits for himself. When the unconscious craving is brought to the surface, what becomes of it, and what is to be done with it? Partly, say the psychoanalysts, it is consumed and overpowered in the very act of bringing it up. Instead of being repressed, it is condemned. The psychoanalyst may also suggest healthy and normal and socially beneficial or harmless ways of gratifying it. But there is something further. It may, according to Freud, be sublimated. By sublimation, Freud understands a process which seeks to utilize the sexual energy, immobilized by repressions and set free by analysis, for higher purposes of a non-sexual nature. In other words, the components of the sexual energy can be made to exchange their sexual goal for one more remote and socially valuable. Quote, "To the utilization of the energy reclaimed in such a way, in the activities of our mental life, we probably owe the highest cultural achievements. As long as an impulse is repressed, it cannot be sublimated. After the removal of the repression, the way to sublimation is open." End quote. All this is interesting and promising. But alas, the doctrine is violently criticized by many other psychoanalysts. Quote, "No normal craving," says one, "can be normally repressed, nor can it be normally sublimated." End quote. And again, quote, "The desirability of sublimation, except as a social convenience, remains to be proved." End quote. In fact, it is doubtful to just what extent Freud himself believed in this theory. In one of his lectures, he said, quote, "If the repression of sexuality is pushed too far, it amounts to a robbery committed against the organism." End quote. He concluded this lecture with a story. A village community kept a horse which was capable of an enormous amount of work. But the wiseacres thought that it was proving too costly by consuming too much fodder. So they began to cut down its ration day by day. It finally got so small that the horse was living on one stalk of hay a day, with apparently no ill effects. The next morning, he was to be taken to work with no food at all. But on that morning, he was found dead in his stall. The sublimation of his craving for food had been complete. The suggestion is plain. Freud is putting the desire for sexual gratification in the same category as the desire for food. I cannot see the justice for that, and I am sorry if, in pointing out his fallacy, I am obliged to utter a few platitudes. Food is absolutely essential to the life of the individual from the day of birth. There is no one to deny it. Sexuality, however essential to the continuation of the race, has no indispensable connection with the individual. No one has ever been known to live without food. How many have lived without sexual gratification, no one can say. But I have no doubt that the number in its totality has been amazingly large. The psychoanalysts point to monks and ordinary individuals who, attempting to deny the flesh, suffered from hallucinations or finally burst forth in abnormal perversions. Most of the examples they cite may be true. All of them may be true. But that would not prove their case. In order to do so, they would have to prove what the logicians call a universal negative. They would have to show that there has never been a case in which the flesh has been denied without physical injury or mental disturbance. Either that, or they would have to supply overwhelming evidence to show that on a priori grounds, such a thing is impossible. They have not done so. They have not come near doing so. And though it is impossible to prove beyond question of any given individual that he has not indulged in any sexual practice of any kind, yet there is abundant presumptive evidence that thousands of prominent churchmen, scientists, philosophers, and quite ordinary individuals have succeeded in absolute chastity and remained otherwise wholly normal. And before going any further, it would be well to call attention to a point of the highest importance. Altogether apart from the truth of one belief or the other, we must consider the moral effect of that belief. If you believe that you cannot get along without sexual or any other particular gratification, then assuredly you will not be able to. But if you believe that you can get along without it, you may have won half the victory. What you believe in this respect will have an overwhelming influence upon what you do. If you are convinced that repression or suppression will lead to mental torture or abnormal outlets, then this fear will be constantly before you. By thinking that you have to yield, you will yield. But if you are confident that the desire can be successfully fought, your confidence will vastly increase your strength to fight it. Whichever your belief, you will tend to make your belief true. One does not have to be a philosophic pragmatist to appreciate that. I hope I shall be forgiven for a liberal use of italics and repetition on this point. I think they are necessary. There is another question in regard to this matter. What is a normal craving? The psychoanalysts, and perhaps they are not alone in this, apparently put the sexual desire on all fours with the desire for food. But the satisfaction of the desire for food does not result in any reaction. It does not weaken a man. It does not depress. It does not enervate. It does not exhaust. And here we should draw a sharp distinction between two words that, up to now, I have been using almost interchangeably. I refer to the distinction between a desire and a craving. We have a desire for food, but a craving for cigarettes, whiskey, morphine. The first fills a positive need and gives a positive satisfaction. The second is largely negative. It may give a positive satisfaction at the beginning, but in its later stages, especially if one becomes a cigarette or a morphine fiend or a dipsomaniac, it merely relieves a sense of discomfort, agony, or torture from which one who is not an addict is wholly free. Is the sexual craving a normal craving simply because it is inborn, while a craving for tobacco, alcohol, or opium is abnormal because it is acquired? But if this distinction is valid, of what real practical importance is it so far as the individual is concerned? Surely the acquired craving may be fully as intense and overwhelming as the normal craving. And people who do not believe this may ponder these examples quoted by Dr. Mussey. Quote, "A few years ago a tippler was put into an almshouse in this state, Ohio. Within a few days he had devised various expedients to procure rum, but failed. At length, however, he hit upon one which was successful. He went into the woodyard of the establishment, placed one hand upon the block, and with an axe in the other struck it off at a single blow. With the stump raised and streaming, he ran into the house and cried, 'Get some rum! Get some rum! My hand is off!' In the confusion and bustle of the occasion, a bowl of rum was brought, into which he plunged the bleeding member of his body. Then, raising the bowl to his mouth, drank freely and exultingly exclaimed, 'Ah, now I am satisfied.'" Dr. J.E. Turner tells of a man who, while under treatment for inebriety, during 4 weeks secretly drank the alcohol from 6 jars containing morbid specimens. On asking him why he had committed this loathsome act, he replied, "Sir, it is as impossible for me to control this diseased appetite as it is for me to control the pulsations of my heart." End quote. Do the psychoanalysts, or does anyone else, believe that it is impossible to fight a craving of this sort, and that there is nothing to be done but give in to it? I do not think so. But if a craving of this intensity can be fought, why not the so-called normal craving? What would the psychoanalysts consider a normal outlet for a normal craving? Just how frequent would indulgence in a given normal appetite have to be in order to be a normal outlet? Will the psychoanalysts or anyone else deny that indulgence in itself develops and increases a craving? Surely the psychoanalysts are the first to declare that abnormal perversions of the sexual instinct are acquired, that they began and developed because the sexual instinct originally took a wrong turn, and were intensified because that was persisted in. But when one has admitted all this, one has come rather close to admitting the unquestionable truth that the sexual craving, as it appears in the adult human being, is itself, in the intensity and particular form it takes, very largely an acquired craving. Let us grant the psychoanalyst's contention that an attempt to fight the sexual craving, as it has become developed, may involve mental anxiety, and even, if the craving be powerful enough, mental torture for a time. Would not the struggle against the craving for drink, developed to the intensity in the dipsomaniacs just cited, or even in far less intensity, also involve mental anxiety and torture? Any conquest or act of will worthwhile involves that. If there were no price attached to willpower, it could be had for the asking. One last argument may be urged in support of the normality of the sexual desire as opposed to other cravings. It may be alleged that, while in its developed and actual adult form, the sexual passion is largely or partly an acquired one, its form and intensity depending to a great extent upon early environment, imitation, decisions at critical times, frequency of indulgence. Yet the organism is endowed with an instinctive propensity without which the sexual craving is developed would never have come into existence. This is true. I have not denied it. But if it is true of the sexual desire, it is true of every other desire. It is true of the developed craving for rum, for opium, for morphine, for overindulgence in cigarettes, or even in candy, or for mere gluttony. The formation of these cravings is possible because the organism has certain instinctive propensities. Men do not usually form passions for ink drinking, or for molten lead, or for eating gravel, because the organism has no instinctive propensity for these things. Every desire, whatever, no matter how perverted or injurious, is the finished product made from the raw materials of instinctive propensities. There are no other finished products, because there are no other raw materials to make them with. Reduced to its lowest terms, stripped of its scientific pretensions and its pseudo-scientific trappings and terminology, boiled down from a ponderous literature into a single sentence, the contention of the psychoanalysts was long ago expressed in the epigram of Oscar Wilde, quote, "The only way to get rid of a temptation is to yield to it." End quote. It would be unfair to intimate that this epigram accounted for Oscar Wilde's own private character and sexual practice, and I will not do so. If he thought of his private character at all when he penned it, the epigram may possibly have been considered by him as a justification of his course. But this would not mean that it was a cause. The ethical philosophy of most men is a system of apologetics. It is a result of their own conduct rather than a cause and determinant of it. But all these considerations aside, let us judge the epigram on its intrinsic merits. Like all good epigrams, it is at least true in a special sense. And the sense in which the epigram is true is that if you yield to a temptation, you will get rid of it. For the moment. That is all the truth there is in it. For the very fact that you have yielded to the temptation will make it return at a later time with increased power and urgency. Every time you yield to it, you do two things. You increase the intensity of the desire and lessen the power of resistance. You form a habit of yielding. You form a habit of yielding not only to that, but to all other cravings. And we have learned what habits are. You develop and strengthen the craving by use, just as you develop a muscle by use. The parallel is exact. In exercising your muscles, you temporarily fatigue them and wear them down. But this very breaking down of tissues calls nutrition into the worn muscles. And when the fatigue is past and the processes of repair have been completed, the muscles are all the harder and stronger. On the other hand, every time you resist a desire, you strengthen your power to resist. Every desire grows by gratification. Feed the desire, it will fatten and grow great. Starve it, it will greatly weaken. It may even die of inanition. This is the true application of Freud's story of the horse. The common experience, not of neurotics and paranoiacs, but of mankind in general, proves this over and over again. It does not need laboratory experiments or elaborate psychiatry to demonstrate it. It ought not to be necessary, but to shield my remarks from misconstruction and misrepresentation, I want to defend myself against any taint of Puritanism in the invidious sense in which the psychoanalysts and Mr. H.L. Mencken use that word. I do not denounce the sexual act as immoral in itself. I do not declaim against the gratification of the sexual passions in what the psychoanalysts call a normal married life, provided the gratification is continent and does not reach the point where it undermines or endangers physical and nervous and mental health and well-being. But I do contend that if, through economic or other circumstances, or disinclination, or inability to fall in love, a man either does not marry or delays marriage, it is perfectly possible for him to lead an absolutely chaste and normal life. And of two unmarried men having equal sexual propensities to begin with, the man who voluntarily restrains them the more is the stronger and the better character. I am merely making this one point, that the sexual craving can be fought, that it can be lived down, that it can be conquered, and that the conquest of it would immensely strengthen the character and make most other moral victories comparatively easy. I hold to the idea of Huxley, of a man, quote, who, no stunted ascetic, is full of life and fire, but whose passions are trained to come to heel by a vigorous will, the servant of a tender conscience. End quote. Perhaps there are psychoanalysts who will agree with all this. Perhaps there are psychoanalysts who will protest against my fulminations, saying they do not hold the views I attribute to them, that I either do not understand their views or that I willfully distort them. If I have been unfair, if I have, through lack of discrimination, blamed all psychoanalysts for the faults of a few, if I have unjustly damned the leaders for the views disseminated by ardent but muddle-headed and ignorant disciples, I am sorry. I have meant only to assault a particular idea. I have tried to be fair, and wherever possible I have taken the psychoanalysts' own words to state their position. But whatever the psychoanalysts do or do not teach, there is no doubt at all about the popular impression of what they teach, and the popular impression, which is the all-important thing, is that they believe it not only impossible to conquer the sexual passion, but highly dangerous to try. This vicious doctrine existed long before psychoanalysts, but the present menace is that psychoanalysis may foster and encourage it by seeming to lend it scientific foundation and support. The doctrine must be utterly demolished, and everything that appears to offer it respect-worthy standing must be examined and exposed. This is all I have attempted to do. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12. Concentration. Thus far I have spoken of the breaking and forming of habits, and of the acquisition of willpower. But, for the most part, I have given only scattered hints on what to do with your willpower after you have it. Most of these hints have been negative. They have talked of the avoidance of certain acts, and where they have been positive, they have been altogether lofty and abstract. We have now to descend from the empyrean of generalities to the forest of details. Your ultimate ends and yearnings I shall, for the moment, take for granted. I assume that you know what you want, that you have definite ideas on where the treasure of happiness is buried, and that you merely seek aid in securing the implements to dig for it. Your aim in life may be wealth, power, fame, or a partnership in the lime and cement business. Assuming its existence, wherever it may be, and the willingness also to pay the price for it, we have now to inquire how the price is to be paid. Your effort of will is not thrown out all at once. You are not asked to pay cash down in full. You are permitted, nay, you are obliged, to pay for your end in installments, in relatively small efforts of will. But these efforts of will must be continuous and sustained. If you miss a payment, the penalty imposed will be exorbitant, and you will have to make a much greater total payment in the end. On the other hand, if your payments are made promptly, you will find the amount called for diminishing all the time. With most ends, one of the requisites will be the acquisition of knowledge, whether one's ultimate purpose be material success or the pure search for truth. The acquisition of this knowledge will require thought and study will require concentration. Now, this concentration will be mainly of two kinds, what I shall call minute-to-minute concentration and what I shall call night-after-night concentration. Minute-to-minute concentration is the ability to keep your mind upon a certain subject for a given period, say for 10 minutes, 1/2 hour, or 2 hours, without interruption. Night after night concentration is the ability to specialize in a certain subject or in a certain branch of that subject until you have mastered it thoroughly, before advancing to other subjects. Ere I go further, I may have to justify the consideration of this question by asserting that concentration is primarily an act of will. It need not necessarily be so, any more than any other good or noble or success-forwarding act need be an act of will. If you enjoy working, getting up early, remaining home nights, staying sober, you will do so without effort. If you are interested in a book or in a particular subject, you will read it or meditate upon it without effort. But you need willpower in action precisely because you do not enjoy doing these commendable things. And you need willpower in reading, thought, or writing precisely because your mind will otherwise be distracted by lack or lapses of interest in the subject at hand, or by greater interest in something else. Now, when you take up the sublime task of training the mind to concentrate, you must remember that the act of will involved is the same in principle as any other act of will. Before you begin, you must be certain in your own mind that the end is worthwhile. There is a price attached to concentration, as there is to anything of value. Concentration is not a beautifully abstract quality of mind. We cannot concentrate in general. The very word concentration implies specialization. It means concentrating on some particular thing. When we devote all or most of our time and attention to one particular subject, we must necessarily have less time for other subjects. In other words, we must be content to remain somewhat ignorant of them, at least for a time. This applies particularly to night after night concentration. If you devote one evening's study to the quantity theory of money, the next evening to the problem of the freedom of the will, the next to incidents in the life of Theodore Roosevelt, the next to historic types of lampshades, your mind may eventually become an interesting depository of stray bits of knowledge, arousing the same sort of quaint enjoyment in the minds of your associates as an old curiosity shop or a second-hand bookstore in which yellow-backed novels of passion and intrigue rub shoulders with scientific treatises and religious sermons. But such miscellaneous reading is not helping you in any ultimate purpose. You are getting nowhere. You will become neither an economist, nor an ethicist, nor a man versed in biography, nor anything else describable with a complimentary name. By trying to know something about everything, you will not only miss knowing everything about something, but you may miss really knowing anything about anything. Your mind may miss the one advantage of an old curiosity shop, that the pieces of furniture in it, though they may not match each other, are at least in themselves complete. If you give only 1 or 2 evenings to a subject, your knowledge of it may be as useless as a chair with 2 legs. But if you are willing to realize that any useful knowledge whatever requires specialization, that it means keeping evening after evening on the same subject, if you take pride in really knowing something about something, then you will be willing to remain ignorant of certain subjects, at least for a given time. Even if, like Bacon, you take all human knowledge as your province, you must remember that even a traveler who circles the globe can go to only one place at one time. I have spoken here only of keeping to one subject on those evenings on which you do choose to study. I have not spoken of the evenings given to other things. It may not be advisable to give 6 or 7 evenings a week to study. One needs one's play to keep from going stale. But there are limits even to this principle. No man will become an Aristotle or a Duns Scotus on an evening a week. Quote, "Most careers," remarked a newspaper writer recently, "are made or marred in the hours after supper." End quote. What applies to night after night concentration applies with much greater force to minute concentration. If the mind is ever to accomplish anything useful, it must be able to keep itself for a reasonable time on a given subject. The very completion of a train of thought on any subject whatsoever depends on it. And the rules are the same old rules. You must first be fully certain in your own mind that the end is worthwhile. For when you are upon any given train of thought, you will find new paths opening up on either side. Pleasant paths. Paths that seem to lead to worthwhile destinations. Paths you are tempted to explore. But you must force yourself to keep on the road that you began. You must first get to the end of that. You may make mental note of these potential digressions to return to them at some later time. Or, if you fear you are going to forget them, you may make written note of them as they suggest themselves. Concentration is not a virtue in itself. The value of concentration depends entirely on the value of the subject concentrated upon. The only qualification to this remark is that it may often be better really to concentrate upon a less important subject than to play and dabble with a more important one. For the less important subject, if concentrated upon, will at least be mastered. I have dealt with this subject of concentration rather extensively in a former book, Thinking as a Science. It was there treated mainly from the standpoint of the intellect. Here, it must be treated from the standpoint of the will. But as the two cannot really be kept separate, and as I would only be likely to repeat myself anyway, I take the liberty of doing so openly. Quote, "Much of our mind wandering is due to the fact that we are not fully convinced of the importance of the problem being attacked, or that we regard other problems or ideas as more important. Concentration consists in devoting one's mind to the solution of one problem. During our train of thought, associations bring up new ideas or suggest problems which do not bear on the question at hand. Now, when we wander, when we follow up these irrelevant ideas or suggested problems, or when we happen to glance at something or hear something and begin to think of that, we do so because of a half-conscious belief that the new idea, problem, or fact needs attending to is important. I have already pointed out that if this new idea is important, it will be so only by accident. If we were consciously to ask ourselves whether any of these irrelevant problems were as important as the one we were concentrating upon, or even important at all, we should find 9 times out of 10 that they were not." End quote. Mind-wandering is only a habit. It must be broken just like other bad habits. But, I hear you say, all this is beyond my control. I can't keep my mind in a book when somebody insists on talking in the same room. I can't write anything when the family in the apartment upstairs plays the Victrola. I can't keep myself to a train of thought with constant interruptions. But, with all due respect to you, and with full realization of the risk I run of losing your respect, I insist that you can. You have done it. Certain allowances must always be made for the unspeakable noises that other people make. But you can ignore them easily enough when the time comes. Can you not recall when, as a boy, you read The Adventures of Jack Harkaway and the Chinaman, so that you became unconscious of the very room in which you were sitting? Has the memory of the smile given you by a certain wonderful girl never come between you and a very prosaic ledger, obliterating the figures as completely as if they were the fancy, and the smile the reality? Has your wife never had to ask you a question 2 or 3 times at dinner before you answered, simply because you were completely wrapped up in some thought of a business unpleasantry that day and did not know that she had spoken? All these forms of involuntary concentration, of which you were not conscious, were possible because the interest in the subject was intense enough. The poverty and freshness of idea and in varied expression tempts me again to quote from myself. Quote, "Whenever a person is left alone for a short time with no one to talk to and no reading matter, when, for instance, he is standing at a station waiting for his train, or sitting at a restaurant table waiting for his order, or hanging on a subway strap when he has forgotten to buy a newspaper, his thoughts tend to run along the tracks they have habitually taken. If a young man usually allows a popular tune to float through his head, that will be most likely to happen. If he usually thinks of that young lady, he will most likely think of her then. If he has often imagined himself as some great political orator making a speech amid the plaudits of the multitude, he is likely to see a mental picture of himself swinging his arms, waving flags, and gulping water. The only way a man can put a stop to such pleasant but uneducated roamings is to snap off his train of daydreaming the first moment he becomes aware of it, and to address his mind to some useful, serious subject. His thoughts will be almost sure to leak away again. They may do this as often as 15 times in half an hour. But the second he becomes aware of it, he should dam up the stream and send his thoughts along the channel he has laid out for them. If he has never done this, he will find the effort great. But if he merely resolves now that the next time his mind wanders, he shall stop it in this manner, his resolve will tend to make itself felt. If he succeeds in following this practice once, it will be much easier a second time. Every time he does this, it will become increasingly easy until he will have arrived at the point where his control over his thoughts will be almost absolute. Not only will it be increasingly easy for him to turn his mind to serious subjects, it will become constantly more pleasurable. Frivolous and petty trains of thought will become more and more intolerable." End quote. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of The Way to Willpower by Henry Hazlitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13. A Program of Work. Most of us live in the street of by and by. We honestly intend to do certain things, and for some strange reason, we keep on intending to do them. There is nothing specially difficult about them. They demand no gritting of teeth, no heroic sacrifice. They are simply not as pleasant as certain other things. They do not have to be done until a certain time, or perhaps there is no particular time at all which they have to be done. They can be done just as well tomorrow as today. So we put them off till tomorrow, that tragic tomorrow that never comes. We become members of what one writer has called the going-to family. We enlist in the army of procrastinators. The worst of it is that many of us do not look upon the doing of these numberless small tasks as anything requiring willpower at all, simply because they do not come in the teeth-gritting class. We intend to do them, and we are apt to think that our intention of doing them makes them as good as done. We are like the habitual cigarette smoker who tells you he could quit at any time. The thing has no hold on him. Only he doesn't want to quit. When we find that many of these little tasks are going by default, many of us, instead of blaming ourselves, indulge in a great deal of self-pity at our lack of time. But a few of us catch glimpses of the truth. We suspect that we are not as efficient as we might be. We may even suspect that our procrastination has something to do with lack of willpower. These two suspicions are correct. Aside from any moral benefit, it would be an untold blessing in itself if we could get these things done. If we had, for instance, a private secretary who would work for the mere honor of it and would not have even to receive instructions. I refer to such tasks as writing personal letters to friends, working off letters that you owe to people, paying bills, sending in your coupons to collect interest on a bond, taking a pair of shoes around to be half soled, or calling for a pair you left there, sorting out the old papers in your desk, bringing neatness out of chaos. I need not elaborate further. You have probably been already reminded unpleasantly of some concrete tasks. These tasks are not performed by intentions to perform them. The first requisite is to set a definite time for them and to allow nothing to make you postpone that time. Instead of saying, "I will have to write Fred. I really must write Fred. It's a shame how long I've been putting it off," you will say, "I will write Fred next Tuesday," or "I will write to Fred not later than next Tuesday." And you will keep a desk calendar or some other form of reminder, and your promise to yourself you will regard as sacred. Now, it may not make a great deal of difference to Fred whether he gets your letter next Tuesday or whether he does not get it until 2 weeks from next Tuesday. But it will make a great deal of difference to you. You will be disciplining yourself morally. You will be building up a will. Beware of curling your lip because these tasks are individually insignificant. The most imposing edifices that humanity has constructed, if I must be eloquent, have been built only by little brick on little brick. Moreover, you will find that these little tasks are getting themselves done. You will live a completer life, free from the ever-present preoccupation of tasks unfinished. And you will experience the peculiarly delightful gratification that comes from a sense of efficiency. Note that there is nothing rigid or brittle about such a program. You may not want to write Fred immediately after you get his letter, for you may not want the correspondence to be too frequent. but by marking a certain definite time, you can do what you had not previously done. A program of work may be laid out for the year, for the week, for the day, or for the hour. Or one program may be contained within the other. You should lay out your longest range program first, for that will define the direction and scope of your efforts. The nature of this long program will depend upon your ultimate purposes in life. Your aim may simply be general culture, but even in this instance, you will realize that haphazard reading is of little value, and you will draw up a list of books to be covered that year. Or you may decide that specialization would be more beneficial, and you may say to yourself, for the following year, I will devote my evenings to the study of money and banking. Or you may decide that specialization would be more beneficial, and you may say to yourself, for the following year, I will devote my evenings to the study of money and banking. Or you may decide to make it the history of English literature, or the appreciation of painting and a critical knowledge of the great masters. Having thus defined your efforts for the year so that you know exactly the goal to which you are heading, you may come directly to a plan for the week. You may decide that 2 or 3 hours should be given to your study or improvement on Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday evenings. Or you may, if you think you have the willpower, allow for something turning up on one of those nights, and simply set aside any 4 evenings a week. I insert the phrase, if you think you have the willpower, because this more elastic plan does, paradoxically, require more willpower than the more rigid program. On Monday and Tuesday, something is likely to turn up. You may be tempted to go to a moving picture. Some friend may suggest bridge. And knowing that your program does not tie you down to Monday or Tuesday, you may accede. But you will find yourself paying for it heavily at the end of the week. And 4 evenings in succession, especially if they include Saturday evening, may strain your willpower to the breaking point. Moreover, in making engagements ahead, you are likely to overcommit yourself. I suppose I could learn it just as well at home as by going to night school, you have often heard people say. But I find that I can't study at home. Here is proof that home study requires more willpower than going to night school. Yet night school is far more rigid, both in its evenings a week and in its hours during those evenings, than home study could possibly be. It is precisely because of this rigidity that night school is easier to attend. But a further element must also be admitted. It is much easier to say to a friend, I'm sorry, I'd like to go, but I have to go to night school, than it is to say, I'm sorry, but I have to stay home and study. Your friend is likely to be skeptical. For some reason, he may be unable to see that an obligation to yourself is quite as sacred as an obligation to others. And once he finds that your program is elastic, your case is doomed. Study, if you must, on evenings when others would like to have you go out, but not when he would. This is his attitude, and it is going to take all your resources of tact to meet it. Moreover, the truth must be told. We are ashamed of having our friends discover that we are seeking self-improvement. That is why we shrink from confessing our real reasons. Your first tendency, doubtless, especially in drawing up any program of work or of little things to do in a single night, will be to plan too much. You will find yourself greatly underestimating the time it takes you to perform a particular task, or greatly overestimating the number of tasks you can perform. A program is valuable if for no other reason than that it brings out, as nothing else could, how you have been frittering away your time before you started to formulate programs. Even if you do not live up to your schedule, you will probably get more work done than you would have without one. But it is bad policy habitually to overplan. You may arrive at the point where you will not even expect to live up to your scheme. It is much easier for the discipline of willpower to plan modestly and to carry out your schedule than to plan greatly and fail. The first builds self-confidence. The second destroys it. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14. The Daily Challenge. Willpower, in its highest sense, is associated with the Napoleons, the Robert Bruces, and the Luthers. We connect it either with great historic characters, men of action who have shaken the world, or with the noble and almost incredible sacrifices of the Christian martyrs. Willpower in the heroic sense is not dead. If anyone had ever thought so, he must have stopped believing so in 1914. Millions of men went forth to die for their faith, and 7 million dead on the battlefield are 7 million crushing answers to the cynic. If men will show such will for their country, they will show even more for their religious faith. Lest we forget the sacrifices of a former age, let me quote a few extracts from Taine's account, taken from Noailles, Fox, Neal, and other sources. Quote, "In 3 years under Mary, nearly 300 persons, men, women, old and young, some all but children, allow themselves to be burned alive rather than abjure. 'No one will be crowned,' said one of them, 'but they who fight like men. And he who endures to the end shall be saved.'" Dr. Rogers was burned first in the presence of his wife and 10 children, one at the breast. He had not been told beforehand and was sleeping soundly. The wife of the keeper of Newgate woke him and told him that he must burn that day. "Then," said he, "I need not trust my points." In the midst of the flames he did not seem to suffer. His children stood by consoling him in such a way that he looked as if they were conducting him to a merry marriage. Thomas Tompkins, a weaver of Shoreditch, being asked by Bishop Bonner if he could stand the fire well, bade him try it. Bonner took Tompkins by the fingers and held his hand directly over the flame to terrify him. But he never shrank till the veins and the sinews burst, and the water, blood, did spurt in Mr. Harpsfield's face. Bishop Hooper was burned 3 times over in a small fire of green wood. There was too little wood, and the wind turned aside the smoke. He cried out, "For God's love, good people, let me have more fire!" His legs and thighs were roasted. One of his hands fell off before he expired. He endured his 3/4 of an hour. Before him, in a box, was his pardon, on condition that he would retract. End quote. Such examples, with all their horror, are a mighty inspiration. They are examples of pure will. We do not know what part of the astounding achievements of Napoleon to assign to his will, and what part to the intellect which was its servant. The fortitude of these martyrs was a fortitude made possible by the will alone. But, however inspiring may be such examples, we must guard against connecting our conception of willpower too closely with them. If we place our conception of willpower too high, we are in danger of failing to recognize it in its humbler forms. The opportunity seldom comes when the will is put to such a test, or anything remotely approaching such a test. The writers of the magazine advertisements for the willpower courses conceive a man of willpower as a man who gets on, an E.H. Harriman or a J.P. Morgan, a dominant personality who must assume leadership and power, who bends others to his will or breaks them if they will not bend, who gets to his goal, if need be, over dead bodies, but who gets to his goal. This is an elevating conception, but the average man of talent is apt to find it a trifle unreal and beside the point after he has finished lesson 1 that evening and gone to work the next day. He is resolved to mow down all opposition, but when he gets to the office, he finds no opposition. Everybody says good morning, pleasantly, though a few wonder vaguely why he has set his jaw so tightly. If he is a bookkeeper, he goes to his ledger and finds the same columns of figures to add up, the same elusive discrepancies to straighten out. And you can't use willpower on figures, because they wouldn't understand it. You can only use willpower on persons. But if he is a sales clerk, he cannot dominate the customers. He must be pleasant and tactful. He might tell the floor walker what he really thought of him, and that might give satisfaction to the soul, but it would be of doubtful value in getting ahead in business. And even a bank or a railroad president meets day after day the same routine problems, many of which involve heavy responsibility, shrewd and mature judgment, and sometimes a good deal of thought, but hardly willpower. The need for willpower thus seems a distant need, which arises perhaps one day in 100, or one in 1,000. In fact, some people seem to feel that there are no outlets for willpower in this workaday world, unless you go out of your way to create them. This appears to be the opinion of no less a thinker than William James, who writes in his Psychology, quote, "Keep the faculty of effort alive in you by a little gratuitous exercise every day. That is, be systematically ascetic or heroic in little unnecessary points. Do every day or two something for no other reason than that you would rather not do it, so that when the hour of dire need draws nigh, it may find you not unnerved and untrained to stand the test. Asceticism of this sort is like the insurance which a man pays on his house and goods. The tax does him no good at the time, and possibly never brings a return. But if the fire does come, his having paid it will be his salvation from ruin. So with the man who has daily inured himself to habits of concentrated attention, energetic volition, and self-denial in all unnecessary things. He will stand like a tower when everything rocks around him, and when his softer fellow mortals are winnowed like chaff in the blast." End quote. This is a noble passage, but I cannot accept James's implied view that daily life gives so few opportunities for the real exercise of will. Our whole modern journey from the incubator to the crematorium is taken in laps of 24 hours each divided sharply from the other, each with its routine much like the other, but each with its own challenge. And our way of meeting that challenge from day to day is our way of meeting the whole challenge of life. Every day we are faced with a challenge, sometimes large, often small, but it is always there if we but face it. We do not have to create it. We do not have to do unnecessary things. And if we meet it, we pay a premium for which we receive a return, and sometimes a handsome one, whether our house burned down or not. One test of whether you have met this challenge or not is in the way you feel at the end of the day. If you have met it, you will be rewarded with a glow of soul. If you have evaded or postponed it, your lot will be a sense of guilt. It may be ever so slight, but it will always be there, an uneasiness, like dirt in a corner. I have already mentioned the little daily duties that most of us put off or leave undone. But there are duties of a more serious sort, duties that require one not only to overcome laziness, but to surmount moral fear. Principal among these are unpleasant interviews. Let us take the very practical matter of asking for a raise. You think you are worth more money. You know you are. You have always known it. You have been waiting long enough for the boss to find it out, but the boss has proved either singularly stupid or singularly selfish, and you have determined either to enlighten him or to uplift him spiritually. Your mind is fully made up. But though your mind was made up a week ago, you haven't asked him yet, because on one day you had a mountain of work that had to be shoveled out of the way, and on the next you had been out late the night before and didn't feel equal to an interview, and on the next you didn't look very neat, and on the next you were waiting for some mistake of yours to blow over, and on the next the boss wasn't in a good mood. In fact, you will tell yourself anything except that you didn't have the courage. And yet, to put off such an interview when you have fully determined that it must be had is like putting off getting up in the morning, or putting off diving into cold water when you have gone down for a swim. The longer you stand at the diving board, the colder the water seems to get, the more terrifying becomes the height at which you are standing from it. There is a psychological theory that emotion follows action, not action emotion. That you do not run away from a bear because a fear seizes you, but that fear seizes you because you are running away. Whatever the truth there may be in this, it is certainly true that though you may hesitate because you fear to dive, you also fear to dive because you hesitate. And the like applies to interviewing the boss for an increase. Here, again, I do not suggest inflexibility. It is sometimes better to do a certain thing in the future, but if you really mean to do it at all, I insist upon fixing a definite time. Another challenge which is apt to occur once or twice in almost any day is the necessity for pronouncing that most difficult of all words for the tongue: no. A friend who has drifted from one job to another finally becomes a salesman for oil stock and wants you to invest in it. Another wants to borrow money. Another wants you to go into partnership with him. Another wants you to spend with him an evening that you have set aside for study. Another offers you a drink after you have signed the pledge. When you are with a young lady, a professional beggar, whom you privately suspect to be a fraud, an idler, and a parasite, perhaps better off than you are, asks for just a little silver change. The answer you would like to give in each case is no. Yet you fear to give offense. You fear to jeopardize your friendship. You fear a nasty retort. You fear having to defend your position. You fear embarrassment. Often, by refusing without unkindness, but with firmness and candor and tact, you can reduce giving offense to a minimum. But it is idle to imagine that you can altogether avoid it. That part which is altogether unavoidable must be faced courageously. A man cannot respect himself if he grants a request or gives money to a beggar, not because he believes the request is fair, or to relieve the beggar's distress, but simply because he cannot look his supplicant in the eye and tell him no. And the necessity for saying no is a daily necessity, an unpleasant duty that you do not have to go out of your way to find. To add to all this, as a daily exercise for willpower, there is always the infinitude of bad habits to be broken and of good habits to be formed. As a mere specific example, a cold shower every morning, if you are physically fitted for it, is an excellent will exercise, which more than pays for itself in its effects upon your health. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of The Way to Willpower by Henry Hazlitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. Second and Third Winds. We have dealt with the humbler tasks. We come now to the tasks that are not so humble. We have considered how we may perform our routine duties. But men of a higher stamp, men with an aim in life, men who want to mean something, are not satisfied with merely performing routine duties. They aspire to something nobler and more soul-stirring. Not content with fulfilling the duties the world lays upon them, they want to lay upon themselves duties to fulfill. Perhaps, with Bernard Shaw, they feel that the true joy in life is, quote, the being used for a purpose recognized by yourself as a mighty one, the being thoroughly worn out before you are thrown on the scrap heap, the being a force of nature instead of a feverish, selfish little clod of ailments and grievances, complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy. End quote. An ideal like that in itself will exalt a man and give part of the strength needed for its own realization. But it carries with it a great danger. This is the danger that the ideal, instead of finding its outlet in action, may evaporate into daydreams and gorgeous intentions whose date for fulfillment is always set at some vague time in the future. As a preliminary antidote for such a danger, I suggest these lines of Goethe. Quote, lose this day loitering, 'twill be the same story tomorrow, and the next more dilatory. Then indecision brings its own delays, and days are lost lamenting over days. Are you in earnest? Seize this very minute. What you can do, or dream you can, begin it. Courage has genius, power, and magic in it. Only engage, and then the mind grows heated. Begin it, and the work will be completed. End quote. What Goethe saw so powerfully, William James saw later, and elaborated the idea in a theory which goes beyond even this. That theory appeared in an essay called The Energies of Men. In all English and American literature, there is nothing of its short length, a mere 35 pages, so calculated to inspire a man with a passion for work. It is published in his Memories and Studies, Longmans, Green, and separately. By all means, read it. Read it if you can before your next meal. If it does not inspire you with a passion to go out immediately and do something large and glorious, you are probably not normal. Every sentence and illustration of that essay is so indispensable and so full of meaning that I cannot hope to give you any summary or the gist of it. I can, however, give you a premonition of what it is about, and this itself can best be done, for the most part, in James's own words. Quote, "Everyone knows what it is," he says, "to start a piece of work, either intellectual or muscular, feeling stale. And everyone knows what it is to warm up to his job. The process of warming up gets particularly striking in the phenomenon known as second wind. On usual occasions, we make a practice of stopping an occupation as soon as we meet the first effective layer, so to call it, of fatigue. We have then walked, played, or worked enough, so we desist. That amount of fatigue is an efficacious obstruction on this side of which our usual life is cast. But if an unusual necessity forces us to press onward, a surprising thing occurs. The fatigue gets worse up to a certain critical point, when gradually or suddenly it passes away, and we are fresher than before. We have evidently tapped a level of new energy, masked until then by the fatigue obstacle usually obeyed. There may be layer after layer of this experience. A third and fourth wind may supervene. Mental activity shows the phenomenon as well as physical, and in exceptional cases we may find, beyond the very extremity of fatigue distress, amounts of ease and power that we never dreamed ourselves to own, sources of strength habitually not taxed at all, because habitually we never push through the obstruction, never pass those early critical points." End quote. For many years, James mused upon the phenomenon of second wind, trying to find a physiological theory. It is evident he decided that our organism has, quote, "stored up resources of energy that are ordinarily not called upon, but that may be called upon, deeper and deeper strata of combustible or explosible material, repairing themselves by rest as well as do the superficial strata." End quote. He compares our energy budget to our nutritive budget. Quote, "Physiologists say that a man is in nutritive equilibrium when day after day he neither gains nor loses weight. But the odd thing is that this condition may obtain on astonishingly different amounts of food. Take a man in nutritive equilibrium and systematically increase or lessen his rations. In the first case, he will begin to gain weight. In the second case, to lose it. The change will be greatest on the first day, less on the second, still less on the third, and so on, till he has gained all that he will gain, or lost all that he will lose, on that altered diet. He is now in nutritive equilibrium again, but with a new weight. And this neither lessens nor increases because his various combustion processes have adjusted themselves to the changed dietary. Just so, one can be in what I might call efficiency equilibrium, neither gaining nor losing power when once the equilibrium is reached, on astonishingly different qualities of work, no matter in what direction the work may be measured. It may be physical work, intellectual work, moral work, or spiritual work. Of course, he admits, there are limits. The trees don't grow into the sky. But the very same individual, pushing his energies to their extreme, may in a vast number of cases keep the pace up day after day, and find no reaction of a bad sort, so long as decent hygienic conditions are preserved." End quote. These are astonishing statements, approaching, if true, a veritable revelation. But James goes on to illustrate the truth of his statement on a wholesale scale. Quote, "Country people and city people, as a class, illustrate this difference. The rapid rate of life, the number of decisions in an hour, the many things to keep account of, in a busy city man's or woman's life, seem monstrous to a country brother. He doesn't see how we live at all. A day in New York or Chicago fills him with terror. The danger and noise make it appear like a permanent earthquake. But settle him there, and in a year or two, he will have caught the pulse beat. He will vibrate to the city's rhythms. And if he only succeeds in his avocation, whatever that may be, he will find a joy in all the hurry and the tension. He will keep the pace as well as any of us, and get as much out of himself in any week as he ever did in 10 weeks in the country. The transformation, moreover, is a chronic one. The new level of energy becomes permanent." End quote. How are we to produce these marvelous results? How are we to draw on our vast unused powers and make them available? How are we to keep ourselves going at the highest efficient speed on all 6 cylinders instead of idling along, knocking on one, losing compression on another, and missing on 3? In the instance of the country folk in the city, the stimuli of those who successfully respond and undergo the transformation are, in James's words, quote, "the example of others and crowd pressure and contagion." End quote. There is also duty. Quote, "The duties of new offices of trust are constantly producing this effect on the human beings appointed to them." End quote. But there are other stimuli than these for bringing out our latent resources. I cannot quote all the inspiring examples which James cites to show the diverse ways in which the resources have been drawn on, but I can summarize the stimuli which he credits for them. They include, in addition to those just mentioned, excitements, ideas, efforts, love, anger, religious crises, love crises, indignation crises, despair in some cases, the suppression of fear thought, which is the, quote, self-suggestion of inferiority, end quote, phrases he borrows from Horace Fletcher, systematic asceticism, quote, beginning with easy tasks, passing to harder ones, and exercising day by day, end quote. Finally, he adds, quote, "The normal opener of deeper and deeper levels of energy is the will. The difficulty is to use it, to make the effort which the word volition implies. It is notorious that a single successful effort of moral volition, such as saying no to some habitual temptation or performing some courageous act, will launch a man on a higher level of energy for days and weeks, will give him a new range of power. In the act of uncorking the whiskey bottle which I had brought home to get drunk upon," said a man to me, "I suddenly found myself running out into the garden, where I smashed it on the ground. I felt so happy and uplifted after this act that for 2 months I wasn't tempted to touch a drop." End quote. There is one stimulus to breaking down the fatigue barriers which James, though he occasionally appears to get close to it, does not mention. It is a very important stimulus. In fact, I am quite prepared to call it the most important of them all. It is sometimes derivative, and includes, in part, 1 or 2 of the stimuli already referred to. This stimulus is intensity of interest. Interest, excitement, absorption in the pursuit of an object make you forget yourself and your discomforts. A man who is so tired out from the day at the office that he cannot read his newspaper on the subway, who brings home some work and is too tired to understand it after dinner, though he makes several attempts and several fresh starts to get his mind down to it, may nonetheless turn to a detective story and follow the course of its characters, the clues, the shrewd mental workings of the detective, trying to anticipate his deductions and conclusions, all with the most intense concentration and the highest relish. He may feel too worn out mentally to sit home and read a consular report on a matter of interest to his business, a report containing no long chains of reasoning, nor a single subtle statement. Yet he will not feel too tired to dress for the theater and enjoy a Shaw comedy to the full, with one clever and subtle epigram touching off another like a package of firecrackers. A stupid office boy will show intelligence about baseball and professional boxing gossip. The explanation in each case is simply a difference in interest. This principle in the mental field applies quite as strongly in the physical. A man who would be completely tired out if he beat a rug for his wife will play 5 sets of tennis in an afternoon, absorbing 10 times as much physical energy. The first is work, and the second, play. Every soldier is familiar with the intense difference it makes to him whether he is drilling with or without music. In the first case, his step is lighter, his heart is lighter, his rifle is lighter, his fatigue is half gone. Modern gymnasiums are beginning to recognize this effect by giving their calisthenic exercises to the music of a piano or a phonograph. But both drilling and calisthenics are considered work, and the principle is still better illustrated at a dance, where a man is quite unconscious, unless his partner is awkward or unattractive, that he is working. Every man who has ever adventured upon a ballroom floor can tell you how much better he can dance, how much more uncontrollable is his craving to dance, how much longer he can dance with good music than with bad. A man will go to a social affair, and he will dance and dance. He will be there for every encore. He will clap and clap for more. And when the affair is over, and the strains of Home Sweet Home have sent him home in spite of himself, he will fall into a taxicab in a state of utter collapse. And when he has arrived home, he will scarcely have the energy to undress for bed. He will finally be in bed at anywhere from 1:30 to 3:30 in the morning. But let him stay in the office till after midnight. Let him work till 1:30 or 3:30 in the morning. And till the end of his life, he will never have done telling about that prodigy of accomplishment. The same principle which applies to the common man applies to the genius. It may sometimes even appear to make a common man into a genius. The histories of philosophy and science abound with examples of thinkers apparently apathetic and indolent by nature, but who, once upon the scent of a new and original theory or discovery, have bent themselves to an enormous and astonishing amount of thinking and reading and experimenting and fact-collecting. The infinite patience and industry of Darwin, once he had hit upon the idea of biological evolution and the struggle for survival, and the change of Herbert Spencer from indolence to ambition, once he had glimpsed evolution as a universal law, applying not only to the body, but to the mind, to nations, to social and economic institutions, to language, to the stars, to morals, to manners, to beliefs and theories, and the marvelous erudition which he acquired in gathering all these facts and weaving them into a gigantic system of 20 volumes of philosophy, in spite of the grave handicaps of poor finances and poor health. These are but 2 examples out of hundreds that might be cited. The common idea that geniuses as a rule are lazy, with a distinct aversion for work in general, is one of the greatest of untruths. The untruth has its origins in the fact that geniuses usually have an aversion toward the particular kind of work which their fathers or the world would set them to. The father would set the son up in some respectable profession, make him a minister, a lawyer, a stockbroker, or have him succeed the father as the head of the tin-plate mills. But the genius will have none of it. He is neither docile nor tractable. He will forge his own path. But if he be a true genius, then once he has struck that path, which natural inclination, nay, which every fiber of his being demands that he follow, his industry and pertinacity will make that of your average respectable businessman look like the merest dawdling. If Goethe had been lazy, could he have turned out 60 volumes? Could Defoe have turned out 210? Could Shakespeare, greatest of them all, have turned out 37 plays and acted in them? Take any classic writer of fiction, Scott or Dickens or Dumas or Dostoevsky, and recall what an imposing thing is the complete works of any one of them when gathered in uniform binding. Could indolent men have wrought these things? We may consider even the classic examples of literary indolence. Samuel Johnson, let us say. He usually wrote only when spurred on by the need of money, and then only enough to keep himself and his wife from starving. After he was pensioned by the king, he indulged his natural sloth by lying in bed until midday and after. Yet, he carried on his magazine, The Rambler, twice a week for 2 years single-handed. He produced 8 volumes of essays, many volumes of biographies, and his immense dictionary, and to pay for his mother's funeral, wrote Rasselas in 8 nights. It is evident that when Johnson once set himself to a task, his powers of sustained concentration were such as only the rarest mortals can equal. What we find in literature, we find in every other art. A lazy Michelangelo could not have built St. Peter's, to say nothing of his other works. A lazy Beethoven or Mozart could not have composed the number of works that these men did. Franz Schubert, known for his easy-going bohemian life, always out of funds, always carefree, yet managed to turn out several overtures, 8 symphonies, and 600 songs. The catalogue does not end with literature and the arts. Napoleon was such a gourmand for work that he could frequently spare only 4 hours a night for sleep, and sometimes went without that. Thomas A. Edison is perhaps the greatest inventor that the world has ever seen. By either inventing or improving the electric light, the phonograph, the telephone, the moving picture, and patenting hundreds of other inventions, he has done more than any single man to make our present-day material civilization what it is. Yet, though now in his 70s, he hardly ever takes a holiday, sleeps only 4 consecutive hours, and works at all hours of the day and night. One could go on and on. And how are these prodigious achievements possible? Geniuses and artists do not doggedly drag themselves through their work. That is not their attitude toward it. They get so much work done because the work they do is their play, their recreation, their passion. And it is so because of their intensity of interest. Warming up to one's work, as cited by James, and the manner in which the mind grows heated, as expressed by Goethe, are simply ways of saying that though you may broach your work without interest and without enthusiasm, you are gradually or suddenly seized by an interest, which up to a certain point continues to mount. With the genius, this interest is greater than with the common man. As psychologists have pointed out, a man is not a genius because he concentrates more than the ordinary man. He concentrates more because he is a genius. His ideas overflow. They come with such rapidity, they change the aspects of his subject with such kaleidoscopic variety, they throw so many new and interesting and dazzling lights upon it, that his attention is sustained by following them. The dullard, no matter how much of a plugger he may be, finds the utmost difficulty in sticking to any train of thought of his own, because his mind will produce only hackneyed and barren ideas, hardly worth attending to. The problem, then, in all creative work is to seek to sustain the interest at the highest pitch, never allowing it to flag. As long as the interest is intense enough, physical and mental fatigue will not greatly matter. 8 times out of 9, it is flagging interest rather than real fatigue which makes us quit. The phenomenon might be represented on a chart by 2 lines or curves, such as the political economists use for demand curves and supply curves. Starting at the top and slanting downward, or starting low, mounting higher, and then curving down again, would be a curve or an irregular up and down line representing interest. Starting at the bottom and slanting upward would be a curve or irregular line representing fatigue. At some point, these 2 lines would meet, and that would be the point at which you would ordinarily quit. There are 2 ways to put off this point. If, by diversification, by turning from one subject to another, by changing the aspects considered even of a single subject, you can sustain or increase your interest, then the top line representing interest will not go down to meet the line representing fatigue. The fatigue line will have further to go, higher to mount. The point of intersection may be surprisingly postponed. But if the 2 lines do meet, you still have a recourse, if you care to use it. That is your will. You can fight through the point by sheer effort, trusting that after a time, either the upper interest line will rise again, or the lower fatigue line will fall, allowing you another spell of achievement. You can fight through the point by sheer effort, trusting that, after a time, either the upper limit line will rise again, or the lower fatigue line will fall, allowing you another spell of achievement, and so on through other points of intersection. Quote, "Heroism," said W.T. Grenfell, "is endurance for one moment more." End quote. I shall be told that this is a very dangerous doctrine, that if put into practice it would lead to overwork, overstrain, and nervous breakdown. It is possible to overdo it, but I am convinced that for the overwhelming majority of those who read this, there is not the slightest danger of such a thing happening. Most breakdowns attributed to overwork do not come from overwork, but from worry, dissipation, and unhygienic living. Indolence will always find excuses for its own existence, and the greatest of these has always been, and will always be, this bogey of overwork. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16. Moral Courage. I must extend a few warnings before we part, and I can do it briefly. Never boast to your friends about your willpower. They are apt to become cynical and facetious, especially when you have broken some major or minor resolution in a fit of absent-mindedness. You want your friends to know of your willpower, but the best way for them to discover it will be through your actions, not your words. Don't be a prig. A prig is a person who has become vastly well satisfied with himself. His chief pastime is to fill the air with lamentations over the shortcomings of other people. He is satisfied with himself because he is so easily satisfied. He is the little Jack Horner who says, "What a good boy am I?" A prig's mind dwells on his successes and on what he has accomplished. Now, true willpower is perfectly compatible with true humility, and a man of true humility dwells on his shortcomings and on what he has failed to accomplish. The prig is satisfied with himself because in his own eye he is realizing his ideals. But one of the reasons for this is simply that his ideals are low enough to make it easy to realize them. A man of true humility puts his ideal always a little beyond his reach. A prig, for instance, takes credit to himself because he reads good books. The man who is destined to grow criticizes himself because, though he reads good books, he does not think enough for himself. A prig admires himself because he has given $5 to the Red Cross. A true man, in the same financial circumstances, may be a little ashamed of himself because he has only given 15. Things of a similar tenor have been said before. Quote, "It is, in general, more profitable," says Carlyle, "to reckon up our deficits than to boast of our attainments." End quote. And the words of Phillips Brooks are more thrilling. Quote, "Sad is the day for any man when he becomes absolutely satisfied with the life that he is living, the thoughts that he is thinking, and the deeds that he is doing. When there ceases to be forever beating at the doors of his soul a desire to do something larger, which he feels and knows he was meant and intended to do." End quote. To resume our admonitions, don't try to be a dominating personality by shouting down your opponents or coworkers. Willpower has no necessary connection with noise. Don't be stubborn. Especially don't be stubborn in your social recreations, under the impression that that is willpower. Don't say, "We will play bridge," whether anybody else wants to or not. Don't break up the party just because it won't play your way. Don't fancy that willpower is incompatible with making yourself agreeable. The difference between stubbornness and backbone you may imagine to be merely a difference in invective. A man who stands for principles in which you believe has backbone. A man who stands for principles in which you do not believe is stubborn. But the true difference, as I conceive it, is that the stubborn man will not listen to reason. He will persist in the course he has adopted simply to maintain his vanity. He won't admit that he has been wrong, though he may know it in his heart. His notion of willpower is sadly false. Willpower is consentaneous to the utmost spirit of conciliation. This does not mean compromise. The man with backbone is willing to listen to argument. He will keep his mind open. But he will not deviate an inch in principle if he knows himself to be right. He will give in before convincing argument. He is big enough to admit that he can make mistakes, and even that he has made one in this particular instance. But he will never give in because of mere lack of physical and moral courage. And moral courage is the rarest of all the rare things of this earth. The war has shown that millions have physical courage. Millions were willing to face rifle and cannon, bombardment, poison gas, liquid fire, and the bayonet. To trust themselves to flying machines thousands of feet in the air, under the fire of anti-aircraft guns and the machine guns of enemy planes. To go into submarines, perhaps to meet a horrible death. But how many had the courage merely to make themselves unpopular? The bitter truth must be told, that many enlisted or submitted to the draft on both sides of the conflict, not because they were convinced that they were helping to save the world, not because they had any real hatred for the enemy, not to uphold the right, but simply because they hadn't the moral courage to face the stigma of slacker or conscientious objector. Perhaps it would be unwise to take for granted that the passions of the war have completely cooled, and possibly many would miss the point if I were to discuss this question from the point of view of our own side. But let us look at it from the German side. The Germans surely had physical courage. Not all of them shouted, "Comrade!" Or if they did, it is rather strange that it took a world in arms more than 4 years to defeat them. But how many had moral courage in Germany? How many dared, like Maximilian Harden, to lift their voices against the dominant German creed? And how high dared he lift his? Fear of death? No, the soldiers faced death bravely. But they feared unpopularity. They dreaded the suspicion of their fellows. What was needed in war is needed no less urgently in peace. How many persons in public or even in private life have the courage to say the thing that people do not like to hear? The ancient Greeks were not a superior race of people, but in the little city of Athens, in a period covering only a few hundred years, there came forth thinkers, the splendor of whose fame has not been paralleled, certainly not exceeded, in all the nations of the world in all the thousands of years that have come since then. Where is the modern triumvirate of philosophers that is greater than Aristotle, Socrates, and Plato? There may have been a number of reasons that brought this flowering of Greek culture, but one of them was this, that thought in Greece was free. A man could arrive at an opinion on a fundamental question different from that of his fellows, without bringing himself into contempt. For 1,000 years after Aristotle, there were no thinkers. And the reason was that thinking for oneself was despised. The authority of Aristotle was absolute. It applied not only to what he had positively said, but to what he had omitted to say. If it was not in Aristotle, it did not exist. When, in time, a few great spirits began to think for themselves, they faced a bitter struggle. Galileo, supporting the discovery of Copernicus that the earth revolved around the sun and not the sun around the earth, was compelled publicly to repudiate it. Bacon had to plead against the authority of Aristotle. Locke had to write, quote, "Some will not admit an opinion not authorized by men of old, who were then all giants in knowledge. Nothing is to be put into the treasure of truth or knowledge which has not the stamp of Greece or Rome upon it. And since their days will scarce allow that men have been able to see, think, or write." End quote. What can it profit a man to be able to think if he does not dare to? One must have the courage to go where the mind leads, no matter how startling the conclusion, how shattering, how much it may hurt oneself or a particular class, no matter how unfashionable or how obnoxious it may at first seem. This may require the courage to stand against the whole world. Great is the man who has that courage, for indeed, he has achieved willpower. End of chapter 16. End of The Way to Willpower by Henry Hazlitt.